Hi, everybody. My name is Christina Phillips, and I'm the Director of Debate at Notre Dame High School. I'm here to give you the lecture on federalism and water policy for the 2021 University of Michigan Debate Institute. So enjoy. The roadmap for this discussion is going to follow defining federalism, types of federalism, the Interstate Compact, and then recent SCOTUS decisions to kind of identify some of the major conflicts that are occurring in federalism over water policy or environmental policy that then affects water policy. So the first thing is just defining federalism. This is a very cute picture of my cats. One is Tyrion and one is Wolfie. Wolfie's the little gray one, Tyrion's the orange one. And the federalism policy, well, number one, my cats are much cuter than federalism policy or water policy. But if you think about the two different parts, think of them as distinct, different creatures, the federal government and the state governments, the multiple state governments. Sometimes they fight over resources. Sometimes they are fighting for power or position in the home, or in this case in the country. And then other times they are cooperating and getting along with each other. It's a picture of them cooperating and creating heat as they sleep. But the general definition then of federalism is the principle whereby the federal government and the states share governance. So it's pretty straightforward. They rule together. And they rule in different ways, but there are different types of federalism, which I'll get into in a second. This is a constitutional principle it's inherent throughout the Constitution, which means that it's implied. It is not, there's nowhere in the Constitution where it says the word federalism, but the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights specifies that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, which means that the states have very, very broad powers. The federal government has only those powers that are explicitly given to it or which the Constitution says the states cannot do. When it says these powers primarily include, it means the federal powers primarily include declaring war, collecting taxes, regulating interstate business activities, but even that develops over time. Initially, it's really just military. It's the statutory definition, though, just to kind of understand how the Clean Water Act sees federalism, that it makes the Clean Water Act makes this a shared responsibility, much more explicit. And in the second paragraph, it says it is the policy of the Congress to recognize, preserve, and protect the primary responsibilities and rights of states to prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution, to plan the development and use of land and water resources, and to consult with the EPA administrator in the exercises of his authority under this chapter. In other words, the first part clearly recognizes the rights of the states to do these things but it also does give an indicator that the federal government can potentially intervene in certain instances. It doesn't explicitly say that, it just kind of leaves room for that to occur with consultation with the EPA administrator in the exercise of his authority. In other words, the federal government's authority in general to create change to protect the environment. But it wants to take the stand that the states still hold significant power over such issues. Now, there are different types of federalism that have evolved over many years. As many different types of Minecraft kitties, there are many different types of federalism, which are characterized by another one of my favorite things, which is cake. Dual federalism. States and federal government have distinct authority over very different areas, meaning if you think of the cake as the federal government, the different slices within the cake, which have clear frosting lines between them and looks pretty delicious, but each of those layers does not touch each other. It does not have they are not blended at all. Just each state kind of does its own thing, while the federal government just makes up the whole. Like 1789 to 1819, there's very little cooperation. There's massive deference to state decisions. In 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland starts to expand the federal authority by using the implied powers doctrine, which says the federal government has can take all necessary and proper actions to maintain the United States. And that is, in this case, the creation of a national bank, but it establishes the doctrine that there are implied powers in the Constitution that the federal government has control over. So it's not just the states. So it expands that. Now, this is partly important. Pre-Civil War, 1789 to 1865, the federal union literally almost exists because of state compacts or through state compacts. In other words, the states negotiate and kind of agree together on what they want to do. In fact, the doctrine of nullification and the doctrine of secession are in play, meaning that the states can nullify a federal government decision. They could just decide not to follow it at this time before the Civil War. And also the doctrine of secession, which becomes important to the Civil War because the southern states secede, which causes the Civil War. But the doctrine of secession indicates how independent the states really do see themselves, and they don't really see themselves unified by the federal government. However, post-Civil War, so post-1865, dual federalism begins to evolve significantly with the passage of the 14th Amendment in particular, because it increases the notion that federal incursion into state affairs, especially over issues of equity, because at this time is obviously Reconstruction, and during Reconstruction, there's an attempt to put the country back together, which requires strong federal regulation and action. Now, even though in the area of equal protection, it did not get that far, we all know after especially last year's topic, for those of you who were involved in last year's topic, that there were setbacks. But in regards to the just notion of dual federalism, that's where it begins to really develop, because the federal government gets more power to encroach, and that kind of spills over into other areas. It doesn't just stay in the area of equal protection, but it begins to spill over into other areas. This is also important because during this time, when it comes to water policy and the environment, the main incursion, so while post-Civil War, it's about equal protection, for the environmental policies, it's really about commerce and settlement. So 1800 to 1900, there is the main power that the federal government has to incur on like state responsibilities is the Interstate Commerce Clause. And so that's kind of the root of federal authority. And that leads to the creation of the Army Corps of Engineers, for example. But the Army Corps of Engineers were only at this time limited to like being able to enable navigation of boats and ships through interstate rivers and that sort of thing. And so that was the Gibbons v. Ogden decision in 1824, where Congress had the authority to regulate navigation on interstate rivers under the terms of Interstate Commerce Clause. So that's kind of the initial Supreme Court case that grants Congress the ability to do that. It then gets expanded to like dams, flood control of the Mississippi River, dredging, and this is also during the era of acquisition. So there's massive expansion of federal authority because things like the Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of Texas, the acquisition of the Southwest, including California, Arizona, Nevada, through the Mexican cession, and the Gadsden Purchase, the acquisition of Alaska, that all these things ultimately mean that the primary focus for the federal government is to really create settlement of the West, because they're concerned that if people don't settle in those areas, that they will not be able to, they won't be able to hold those areas against Native American tribes, or they won't be able to hold those areas against, border disputes that are occurring with Mexico. So this really is about homesteading, hence the Homestead Act of like 1862. The reason I say that is that it was partly that for the federal government to intercede in state policies and starting to create this notion of dual federalism between the federal government and the states, that the primary modus operandi of federal intervention was for settlement and development of economic resources at the time. The notion of manifest destiny, all of that is very prevalent and in the creation of dual federalism for the environment at this time. So the next section is cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism starts to come about and complicate things, whereas dual federalism was kind of clear lines between the states. Cooperative federalism was the kind of blending of federal and state authority. It's no longer clear. It looks more like a marble cake, like this picture in front of you. And so not a layer cake, but a marble cake. And they're still distinct. You can still see that there are different government groups involved, but their responsibilities are not so clear anymore. They're not so clear cut. This is especially true with as Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism and the creation of federal grants, largely for the environment at this time, Wilson's federal income tax and FDR's New Deal, that they create funding programs that where they begin to cooperate in order to kind of move forward. However, I want you to note that a lot of this under like Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson, and FDR, they still saw the national or the federal government really setting the agenda and then giving grants that kind of force the states to take certain actions. And the grant programs did become very popular because like with FDR's New Deal, this is happening after the Great Depression, which means that the states are really hurting for resources for people. And as a result, they want the federal government to step in with funding in order to solve or help their own constituents because they don't necessarily have the funds to do that. And then part of this is supported by like federal income tax and whatnot. But the application of water policy, in this case, like very specifically with the environment, Roosevelt is a really good example of this because he massively expands the focus of the federal government to improve or to protect national parks and resources. So he creates there's the Reclamation Act of 1902 that commits the federal government to a major role of development of water resources and the use of irrigation in arid Western states. So right before this, there's a massive survey of Western states for settlement purposes from John Wesley Powell, who then says, in order for the settlements to be successful, you need irrigation. So Roosevelt in 1902 is like, great, we'll commit a ton of resources to irrigation, which is partly why to this day, there's so much water use like in California, like Central California in particular for agriculture and things like that, that part of that was the movement for settlement into the West. But the Federal Power Act of 1920, Congress decides to limit the federal role of hydropower, but then kind of creates the Federal Power Commission and starts to kind of expand the ways that states and the federal government will balance out responsibilities for the creation of hydropower and then later dams and things like that. So the couple other things that are created at this time for water policy, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the Corps. Congress creates the Tennessee Valley Authority for soil and water conservation. There's also the Department of Agriculture that's created so that it can help oversee some of these irrigation projects. The National Resources Planning Board, which was at the time, was the coordinating federal water programs, actually abolished in 1941 But that also then leaves these different agencies. So originally there was like kind of a coordinated, the National Resource Planning Board was like this coordinated function that kind of just oversaw water projects and funding. And that was abolished in 1941, which now leaves competition for different agencies to get different water projects going, but also kind of then leaves room or this myriad of like state action to start to compete, which means that just to kind of understand the bigger picture, most of the water project funding went to the Army Corps of Engineers. However, Congress started a new program within the USDA during this period directed to smaller projects in rural agricultural areas. So it then created the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act of 1954, which authorized federal support to reduce erosion, flooding, and water supplies in small watershed levels. So in other words, in small rural communities or small watershed areas in small watersheds, they would be able to increase funding. So you can see there's like this growth in grant programs for very specific purposes from the federal government, meaning the funding is tied to very specific purposes. I would say that like during this time, the funding of water projects really becomes the most significant instrument to distributive projects or distributive politics. So in other words, there are project beneficiaries that are the states, there are federal construction agencies, there are members of Congress, and they all kind of unify to what's called the Iron Triangle. So to secure federal program, to secure federal water projects, because there's growing interest, like at this time in the 40s and 50s, kind of who is going to get the money for these different projects. And as a result, several different commissions or committees are created: the Hoover Commission, the President's Water Resources Policy Commission, the House Subcommittee to Study Civil Works, the Second Hoover Commission, the Presidential Advisory Committee on Water Resources Policy. There are so many different commissions that are created this time, again, for the control of water quality and all of those things. That ultimately, there is also an attempt to regulate pollution by the federal government in 1959. The Senate Select Committee on Water Resources says that federal action should occur in 5 particular areas: stream flow regulation, water quality improvement, underground water storage, increased efficiency of water use, and increased water yield through desalting and weather modification, in other words, desalination. And this was one of the first government attempts to start to look at how to protect certain water resources. So beyond development and settlement, that there's an attempt to have the federal government now also start regulating pollution and overseeing that process. So starting to create studies about that process. Ultimately, cooperative federalism in this area is the federal government giving money that is tied to very specific purposes, pretty massive expansion of the federal government into funding certain projects, but then gives it power over the states. But then we go to creative federalism, and this really happens in like the 60s. I think it's the most obvious with like the civil rights movements or legislation that's coming out of this time and litigation that's coming out of this time, but it can also apply to just understanding how, or setting the groundwork for some of the work that, or some of the water policies that come about later. Creative federalism. It expands the federal role through grant and aid systems, but this time federal regulation is directly tied to like national priorities. Johnson's Great Society Initiative, he creates block grants, and they were previously separated grants that were consolidated, but they were all consolidated, and then they could be used for multiple purposes. So the grants could be redistributed with less specific requirements to allow greater flexibility for state and local governments. So even though the federal government was still setting the agenda, the states were now given a little bit more freedom to decide how these different block grants were going to be used. They were encouraged to come up with nuanced solutions in their jurisdiction, as opposed to just saying the federal government would be like, this is what you need to build this, or, create this program. Instead, it was like, this is for, flood control, find creative ways to address flood control, or this is for a different particular water policy program. And then they would give them creative ways to solve that. A lot of times the block grants were not so much targeted at water policy, but more at like medical care for the elderly and the poor, highway systems, lots of transportation and highway systems. Block grants are given out at this time. But the application of water policy is in the late 1960s, and then in the 70s is really when protection and enhancement of water supplies starts to become the focus of the federal government. The Environmental Protection Agency is created in 1970, the 1972 Coastal Zone Management Act, which linked water quality protection efforts of the EPA to the NOAA, and coastal zone planning. The Clean Water Act is created in 1972, and 1977, which there are modifications to the Water Pollution Control Act, which then becomes the Clean Water Act. And then there's the Endangered Species Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, which have all been discussed by prior people, so I'm not going to go over them again. But the point is that during like the 60s and 70s, this notion of federalism kind of gets, there's a broad expansion of federal intervention for now, not just the purpose of economic development, but also for the purpose of protection of the resources that have been developed. And that means that they can regulate state commerce, right? Or in particular, interstate commerce. Again, that's kind of the driving principle behind it for that. But eventually, after that, so this is kind of like, it also, again, the 70s, but goes into the 90s, there's this, now all of a sudden a sliding back. So it starts with like the block grants becoming more and more general. Nixon continues to expand block grants and says, I'm not gonna really, he kind of removes a lot of ties. Ford and Nixon increase block grants, but then it gives the states a ton of flexibility. They start to remove the kind of requirements. Now this, I put lots of different cakes, because this is really a move again towards the states being able to kind of deal with policies. Like the federal government said, make a cake, and the states were like, we can do it in all these different ways. And that creates innovation. And so this is not an analogy, by the way, whereas like layer cake and marbled cake are actually language that's used in federalism literature. The like many different cakes is not language it's used in the federalism literature, but they continued to reduce the federal role in governance from the 70s and 90s, which means that Nixon and Ford expand the block grants. Clinton kind of pulls that back a little bit, though. Well, Reagan first begins to pull it back. Reagan starts to implement devolution or devolvement, where he cuts the block grants. He returns to states by compact ideology, where the federal government does not hold as much sway, and he tries to reduce the role of federal interference. This is, interestingly, though, marked by a period of economic growth, which means that the states are more economically able to support themselves. Not completely, like obviously the cutting of federal programs hurt certain groups, so I don't want to imply that's not true, but in the context of, kind of the general trend was that it seems like when there's an economic downturn, the states start to ask the federal government for more and more money because they're having a hard time. And the states, a lot of the states need to have balanced budgets, which is an important concept, really, whereas the federal government can print money. So if you're reading the DAMS Act, the Bailey evidence, I believe the Water Infrastructure Act, the Bailey evidence, like the third solvency card kind of talks a little bit about like the balanced budget versus being able to print money essentially and have a larger pot of funding. But anyway, Reagan starts to devolve this power, and Clinton actually continues that. Clinton and the Republican Congress continues that. He kind of implements the Reinventing Government initiative, which means that the government has to actually pull back on its spending and has to review why it is doing such things, kind of to eliminate waste, economic waste, like spending unnecessary money. And this is when, during this time, the unfunded mandate legislation comes about, which requires the federal government to do a cost-benefit analysis for state and local governments impacted by unfunded mandates, meaning that if the federal government issues a regulation that then creates an undue burden on the state governments can sue and say it's an unfunded mandate and that we do not have to adhere to such a regulation because we cannot afford it. And it spurred a lot of conversations about block granting and cutting numerous federal programs. So the federal programs, it became a reason why the federal government either had to fund programs or maybe had to remove a regulation. And it became a balance between those two, or at least was meant to be. At this time, the Supreme Court of the United States is actually increasing devolvement as well. This is especially true because of the US v. Lopez, which is a much often cited case that increased state rights. In this case, it was about gun control near schools. And then there was also a Seminole tribe of Florida versus Florida Supreme Court, where the SCOTUS ruled in favor of state autonomy, deciding that Native American tribes could not sue states over gambling compacts on Indian land. In other words, if the states could not be sued and would maintain authority in that area. So during the 80s and 90s, the Supreme Court overturned more federal laws than the previous 200 years. Just to give you an idea of how much the Supreme Court started to roll back federal authority that had been growing over the last like 100 years before that. What does this mean for water policy, though? You can see that in 1980, initially, there's a creation of the Superfund, so the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, or Superfund, and they would spur new research for water quality and health issues, and Superfund legislation helped clean up pollution, essentially. So it's part of that time period of protection of the environment, but also then backed it up with like monetary funding for that, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because during the 80s, that's when devolution is occurring, but at the same time, before the 90s, so before the unfunded mandate, there's this like massive expansion of federal funding to cleanup efforts. But then, and there's several other monetary programs, the Farm Bill, the Conservation Reserve Program, the Wetlands Reserve Program, all of these make payments to different groups. So Farm Bill, Congress includes conservation provisions in the Farm Bill that were intended to minimize agriculture's role in degrading water quality. So, funding for cleaning up certain efforts or to minimize kind of the runoff from agriculture into water. Conservation Reserve Program authorized payment to landowners who temporarily retired lands that were highly erodible or that were environmentally sensitive. In other words, it would fund them to conserve parts of their land. Wetlands Reserve Program, all of these different things. The Water Quality Incentive Program, that offered technical and financial assistance to farmers willing to modify agricultural practices to reduce non-point source pollution. So kind of in the 80s, early 90s, you're seeing kind of a really expansion of some of these funding programs, but at the same time, you're seeing a devolution to the states in regards to regulation, but also then a review of those programs for waste. And so there's overall, though, there are some cuts to funding that occur as of Reagan and Clinton, but there's still some programs out there. So modern cooperative federalism. This is characterized, and this is actually a term used in literature, the picket fence, that the federal government and states are empowered to negotiate with each other. So now they are much more equal in actors. So we've gone from a period of like states having all the power, to the federal government really amassing significant power, to the federal government using funding in order to incentivize, but then the federal government pulling back some of that funding, and the states now developing some of their own programs. That there's the federal government has grants and kind of sets a national agenda, but the states ultimately are responsible for implementation and detailing or innovation for their specific constituencies. So that these, the notion of the picket fence, and this is kind of where we are now. And I'm going to talk about uncooperative federalism as well and how that applies, but the concept of uncooperative federalism. But in the modern cooperative federalism, there is now a lot more give and take between the federal government and the states, that it is not really one power has significantly more, or one group or set of governments has more power than the other, but there is a constant action of negotiation. There's a constant negotiation. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what that then means for uncooperative federalism. So states are given increased flexibility to set an agenda for the environment, and the federal government only intervenes in interstate issues. So I have little kids up here. The one little kid like pushing his or her, she is pushing her face into the cake. And these really uncooperative federalism, if you want to think about it this way, I feel like, you know, the kid in the polka dot shirt is, you know, the states, and they're saying they've got the better system and that they're going to then make the federal government do their will. And that's what really uncooperative federalism is that the states just have increased flexibility, but it's characterized by really what was happening during the Trump administration. So I want to talk a little bit about that. When Trump first gets into power, Pruitt and then Wheeler immediately after him are poised to reinvigorate environmental cooperation. In fact, Pruitt says cooperative federalism must be respected and applied by the EPA with regard to our environmental laws, and kind of takes a big stance on environmental federalism, but then resigns after 8 months and then is replaced, like so many people in the administration, by Wheeler. And Trump continues to remove federal regulations, but at the same time, never really empowers the states, because then puts pressure on the states to alter internal environmental priorities, especially as they relate to climate change. So there's this like federal action to suppress state action that disagrees with the administration's policy on climate. But then there's also this like federal deregulation that's happening at the same time. So then it becomes the question of who acts for the environment as opposed to just like allowing for deregulation. And ultimately, this is really encapsulated by the battle over the waters of the United States language. So to give you some background, in 2015, Obama has a document, this like whatever long document, that defines the waters of the United States. It's based in like scientific research, like years of scientific research, and it attempts to resolve uncertainty by pushing the needle towards the federal side. So in other words, the federal government is given more power to protect the waters of the United States because the definition of the waters of the United States per the Clean Water Act are clarified to include like ephemeral, intermittent waters, which means that even if they are not connected to major waterways within a state, they can still be regulated by the federal government. So in a lot of ways, this opens the door for the federal government to require permitting and licensing by the EPA for pollution, or in waterways that are not necessarily connected or that are even intermittent in certain areas. So again, it kind of expands the protection of wetlands in particular, and that sort of thing. However, in 2019, the Navigable Water Protection Act, which you'll see in the literature, like liberal sources will refer to it as Trump's dirty water rule, but the official name is the Navigable Water Protection Act. That in 2019, Trump issues an executive order that directs the EPA and the court to review the 2015 rule in light of national interests to ensure that the nation's navigable waters are kept free from pollution, while at the same time promoting economic growth, minimizing regulatory uncertainty, and showing due regard for the roles of the Congress and the states under the Constitution. So in other words, ultimately, the executive order then tells agencies that it should be defining waters of the United States according to the Rapanos decision. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Rapanos decision. It's Rapanos v. US, and the decision that is written by Justice Scalia at the time in 2006. So ultimately, what was the Rapanos decision? The Rapanos decision combines two cases on appeal from the Sixth Circuit. And the ultimate question was, does the phrase waters of the United States in the Clean Water Act include a wetland that at least occasionally empties into a tributary of a traditionally navigable water? In other words, it's not consistently spilling into a navigable waters area, but is intermittent. And this was a very, very split decision. In fact, the decision was unanswered technically because it was a 4-1-4. Kennedy provided the crucial fifth vote to reject the Sixth Circuit's decision, but Scalia wrote the plurality opinion, which means the opinion of most of the justices, of the first four justices, I should say. But it held that the word navigable in the act cannot be divested of all meaning. In other words, it can only refer to relatively permanent, standing, or flowing bodies of water, not occasional, intermittent, or ephemeral. In other words, it undid the 2015 WOTUS rule because the Navigable Waters Protection Rule established that WOTUS, the waters of the United States, cannot include occasional, intermittent, or ephemeral flows. And that also means that certain wetlands, for example, would no longer be protected. And they're not just wetlands, but also just like some ponds that potentially could flow through groundwater into other streams and things that could go into navigable waters. Those were no longer protected. Now, the reason I say that the battles over WOTUS are an example of uncooperative federalism is because some parts of states were happy with the overturning, and other states were like, we want to protect the intermittent, ephemeral bodies of water. And there then ensued legal battles over whether or not the states could go farther than the federal government in this respect in restricting business, maybe licensing or businesses that were given the power to act in certain bodies of water. And so the uncooperative federalism, which you probably heard in last year's topic, if you debated the NGA counterplan, or the National Governors Association counterplan, where governors would get together. There's some logistical issues with this counterplan, but governors would essentially agree to threaten the federal government that if it did not do the plan, that it would not get on board with these other things. And so because under more modern notions of federalism, the states are really seen as the ones who apply or implement the different laws, that the argument is that gives them the power then to withhold such implementation in order to force the federal government to take action, which would be a threat, essentially, or a withholding of some implementation in order to force the federal government's hand. This maybe doesn't make as much sense under Biden. So you can see that the notions of federalism kind of shift depending on the presidents who are in power. Because Biden, since then, actually on June 9th, 2021, his administration has stated that it would want to remove wants to reevaluate the Navigable Waters Protection Act and essentially revert back to the 2015 rule, or sorry, I keep calling it an act, but the Navigable Waters Protection Rule would want to essentially roll that back and use science-based research to establish that the water should be protected. So if you look on June 9th, there was a press review that indicated that they were going to roll that back. And part of the reason why I don't think that uncooperative federalism, let me finish that thought, why uncooperative federalism doesn't matter as much maybe under Biden is it only matters if the states want to force Biden to do some particular action. In the case of environmental federalism, most of the time uncooperative federalism occurs when the states go farther than the federal government to protect the environment. And so that becomes important. But I think in this case, the federal government, since it's trying to implement a climate change policy, it's trying to implement protections of broader protections of water resources in America, that uncooperative federalism doesn't make as much sense unless you want to decrease the environmental regulations. If there are states that want to go against the Biden administration's push to regulate, then maybe they would use uncooperative federalism to kind of force the hand of the federal government to deregulate in this instance. Whereas under Trump, you had several states, namely states like California, trying to go significantly farther than what Trump's administration would want to allow. All right, I've thrown a ton of information at everybody. Take a deep breath. Telling myself. All right, interstate compacts. Interstate compacts, the reason I'm talking about this, because one, there's already an interstate compact counterplan put out at camp, but I think that these are very significant for water policy in general. What is it? An interstate compact is an agreement between or among two or more states of the United States to become effective. It must be approved by those states' respective legislatures, and depending on the subject matter of the compact, consented to by Congress. So there are two things that have to occur for an interstate compact to be legit. One, all of the states' legislatures have to agree and approve the actual compact. And number two, for certain matters, the Congress must consent to an interstate compact. Why is this true that Congress must control the interstate compact? So what this means is the states come together, let's say like California, Colorado, Nevada, so on and so forth. They come together and they have discussions about how to apportion water. In other words, how to decide who's going to get what amount of water from a particular body of water. And many of you have probably already read about the Colorado Basin Compact, that sort of thing. So anyway, that is what a compact is. It's just a simple agreement between states. So one of the things that the interstate compact file refers to is like horizontal compacts or federalism. Horizontal federalism just means agreements between states. So it's really the same, to me, it's almost like the same thing as saying interstate compact, but it's talking about the federalism between the states as opposed to the federalism between the state and the federal government. All right, compacts clause is what clarifies that Congress has to approve or give consent to a interstate compact. And the reason I think this is interesting is because I think it can really start to generate some ideas for how you can maybe start getting some inroads into the counterplan itself. If you can establish that the interstate compact or would require a congressional consent, and such consent would need to go through the Senate and the House, and that would cause political controversy, which then might trigger like a politics DA if they're trying to claim that that is a net benefit to the counterplan. So the compacts clause clarifies that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power. Meaning that, however, I want to clarify that ultimately, even though it says no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement. Any does not mean all in this instance. The courts kind of established that that's not what it means. It only means in certain instances, and we'll talk about what those instances are. But a lot of times the ability of the states to do interstate compacts was seen as like a democratic principle, that they didn't want the federal government to carry so much power. They wanted the states to have the ability to cooperate, to create innovative solutions. Again, very important with water, given that water flows over state borders and is interstate. So we'll go to that. So congressional consent. A compact requires congressional consent if it alters the balance of political power between the state and federal government and intrudes on a power reserved for Congress. I think this is somewhat interesting because if somebody's reading a federalism DA to the interstate compacts counterplan, and they're arguing that the balance of political power is shifted, then that means that the counterplan would require, if the federal government acting would be a shift in, would alter the balance of political power, then the states acting may also shift the balance of political power back or away. They would have to kind of walk the line of like the counterplan is the status quo or maintains the status quo in some way, in regards to federalism, I should say, like maintains the uniqueness of the state governments against the federal government to get out of this argument. But if they're correct that there is some sort of shift of political power balance between the federal and state governments as a result of the interstate compact, then it would require congressional consent. That means that, and I'll talk a little bit how it's given, but that means that there's a little bit of tension between if there's a federalism disad run as a net benefit to an interstate compacts counterplan. And you just want to think a little bit about that tension potentially between those things. The second reason a congressional consent would be required is it intrudes on a power reserved for Congress. This can be also affected by, like, if non-party state interests are affected by the determination of the compact, then the court could actually find, or Congress could decide that they have to give consent because they have to determine the effects that it would have on the non-parties, the parties not included in the compact. So for example, if let's say it's, the Great Lake region, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, these areas, if they are come together with a compact about water, but let's say it affects Ohio, then the question is how, if Ohio says, no, this affects us, then Congress may have to give consent and evaluate whether or not Ohio's non-party status affects the nature of the compact or whether or not they should be involved in it. So the question is then, how is consent given? Well, it's given in 3 different ways. Explicitly, this is most frequently seen in compacts that resolve boundary disputes. So if there was a conflict between, where the line is between California and Nevada or something. But the type of consent is granted after the compact has been adopted by the requisite number of state legislators and submitted by the member states to Congress for approval. That means that approval, the Congress is able to review and amend and or revise the agreement, and as a result is able to provide a determination of approval or disapproval. That means they need time to kind of review it. Explicit congressional consent is considered necessary in a lot of times because implicit consent does not mean that Congress automatically agreed with it, and there could be issues with it later on. Just to clarify, the Constitution ultimately doesn't clarify how congressional approval is given, but it looks like any other legislative approval process for any other federal statute. So the House or Senate introduces the compact bills, and then those congressional bodies must approve it in the House or the Senate, and the president still has to sign the compact into law. So just like any other kind of statute, it would follow the same procedures for voting. The implicit is the second way that consent can be given. And a lot of times implicit consent kind of is where, like, the federal government, it is already kind of stated, well, that's preemptively, but border compacts establish or alter boundaries of a state as a result of a conflicting territorial claim. Congressional consent may be implied when actions by the states and the federal government demonstrate approval of the compact. So in other words, let's say after the compact happens, the federal government takes following actions that just kind of build on what the compact has already done. That would be implicit. But that's, again, a little bit risky because there's not a clear indication that Congress is going to agree with it until it decides later on whether or not it agrees. For example, there can be federal actions or legislation supporting the terms of the compact, or granting power to the language of the compact, or using the same language as the compact that then becomes legal. Now, preemptively, Congress may give its approval in advance by actually adopting legislation and then prompting the states to build compacts that implement a piece of legislation. So they've actually said, we want you to create a compact to create innovation in this area. There are a couple examples. The Environmental Protection Act of 2005, it granted 3 or more contiguous states the right to enter into an electric transmission line siting compact. In other words, it said, you need to go figure out how we're going to deal with these transmission issues and cite them. Another one was the Non-Admitted Insurance and Reinsurance Act. This is not related to water, but just another example of implicit congressional consent. Now, the Congress can withhold consent. When does Congress withhold consent? It feels approval may lead to imprudent combinations, dangerous or joint action. So for example, foreign countries are part of the compact. It may be nope, you cannot enter into this compact. Foreign countries, this is the role of the federal government. You could get into dangerous federal matter. If it deals with substances that are dangerous, then it might do that, or the content itself is dangerous. It has the potential to alter the balance of power between the states and the federal government. Again, very ambiguous, but just to note, Texas v. New Mexico and Colorado in 2018, that SCOTUS decision actually said that Congress has the right to intervene in a interstate compact, because a water interstate compact, because it is in the federal interest in order to do so and to protect water resources. So that's important to note, that the federal government, the SCOTUS has already ruled that the federal government can intervene in a water compact. So an important thing to note is interstate compacts don't bind Congress. Congress can still exercise legislative agendas that contradict the compact. Tobin and Mineo are SCOTUS decisions that said that Congress is actually not held. It says, while congressional consent may transform an interstate compact into federal law, consent does not transform a compact into a binding agreement between the states and the Congress. In other words, Congress is not held to what the states have agreed to. The states, however, are held to what they have agreed to with each other once Congress has approved it. Ultimately, what's interesting about interstate compact, it's one of the only like state agreements that then becomes federal law with so little federal involvement. The congressional consent makes the compact federal law absent compelling evidence that the consent was not required. So if consent was not required, then it becomes law. If congressional consent is required, it becomes law once the Congress grants such consent. Notice though that it can be modified by the federal government, and if the states don't accept that modification, then they would have to go back to the drawing board because they would not get congressional consent, or they would the federal government, they can accept the federal government's modifications and then just amend the compact, and then the states would have to agree to it. But the federal government can make modifications in this process, which is somewhat interesting. So how does this apply to water? Water interstate compacts. There are many interstate water compacts. And if you put in that phrase, you'll see a lot of them. It allocates water rights for particular bodies of water to the party states. The purposes of interstate compacts, I've seen 4 primary purposes between the compacts: water apportionment, water resource management, flood control, and pollution. There are very, very few having to do with pollution. The couple that I found were like the Lower Mississippi River Interstate Pollution Phase Out Compact and the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Compact. They're the most, I think, widely recognized or kind of famous, quote unquote, infamous compacts are the Colorado River Compact. The Pecos River Compact has been the subject of a Supreme Court decision. Some of the others, those are probably the apportionment ones were the Colorado River Impact and the Pecos River Compact. The Pecos River has barely any water in it. It's very temperamental. There have been several others. The Apalachicola and the Chattahoochee Flint River Basin Compact was the subject of a recent SCOTUS decision, as well as, there was another one that I'm blanking out right now. So there are several river compacts or several water compacts that deal with different issues. So I would suggest looking into those as you start to do interstate compact research so that you can see how different ones apply. The benefits, by the way, of a water compact or an interstate compact is that it solves the kind of the coordination issues that oftentimes are the federal key warrants for why the federal government needs to act while still maintaining state sovereignty over such issues. So that is one of the primary reasons, and the fact that it does eventually become federal law through congressional consent. But I think you'd have to cut some cards about, like, doesn't link to that benefit because of congressional consent. All right. Recent SCOTUS decisions. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to kind of push through, but these are important. See if you can find the kitty in the picture because it's important. All right, so what are the current justifications for federal intervention into state water policies through the United States? And I want to look at some of the most recent decisions. The first one is the decisions that upheld federal authority. The first one is the County of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund in 2019. The core question was whether or not, so the thrust of the dispute was whether the Federal Clean Water Act would require a point source permit for a local government's wastewater treatment wells, or whether regulation of those wells would be left to a state managed program. In other words, the Clean Water Act, would it allow licensing, or would the local or state managed program do the well programs within the state, would that actually require licensing from according to the Clean Water Act, so federal licensing, or are they exempt from that and they do not require such things? The decision ultimately affirmed the federal, or in this case, the state role. The majority decision confirmed the Clean Water Act's permitting requirement applies to direct discharges into federally protected waters and indirect discharges that are functional equivalent to such discharge. That means that the federal authority was ultimately upheld. I just misspoke for a second. I was looking at the other slide. So in other words, they decided that ultimately the federal government was going to be the federal, sorry, I've talked about so many things. Give me one second. That the Federal Water Act's permitting requirement applies to direct discharges. In other words, it actually applied and would require permits for local government wastewater treatment wells, and that they would not just be left to a state managed program, that the federal government should be able to regulate such things and require permits for them. There were dissenting opinions. Thomas and Gorsuch dissented on federalism grounds. Thomas opined that his interpretation would tie the statute more closely to navigable waters on the theory that they are at least a channel of these kinds of commerce. In other words, it greatly expands what waters the United States would be included, and Alito dissented for other reasons that were not tied to Thomas and Gorsuch. That kind of gives you an indication of like who is for and against. The majority of the decision was Breyer, Roberts, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Kavanaugh at this time. This second decision that also upheld federal authority was the Texas v. New Mexico and Colorado. I already talked briefly about this decision, but essentially the question was, may the United States properly intervene in an action involving a dispute over a compact between states? And it was a unanimous decision that the United States is permitted to intervene in a particular dispute over the compact between states to defend distinctively federal interests that a normal litigant might not be permitted to pursue in traditional litigation. In other words, in this case, the states would have to go to the federal government to resolve this dispute because it involves distinctly federal interests in regards to interstate connections or water connections. So it upheld federal intervention. Now the states, there are, I misspelled it, but the state authorities upheld the Virginia Uranium Inc. versus Warren is a 2019 decision, and also the Atlanta Richfield v. Christian. The Virginia Uranium v. Warren decision ultimately found that the federal government does not regulate conventional uranium mining on private land, having long taken the position that its authority begins at the mill rather than at the mine. And as a result, it is not the federal authority, or the decision ultimately found that the federal government did not have the ability to regulate whether or not Virginia would allow mining or uranium mining. So in other words, the states could decide whether or not that uranium mining would actually occur, and that did not interfere with the regulation of uranium milling. So in other words, it found that uranium mining, which by the way, is a potential AF if you think about it, because uranium mining actually can affect waterways. But again, I'm not sure. That's probably effectually topical, maybe in some ways. So, but ultimately, the federal government could not interfere because uranium mining was seen as a state issue, whereas milling was seen as a federal issue, which was separate from the mining. The Atlanta Richfield v. Christian, what the core question before the case or before the court was whether state common law claims could supplement EPA's cleanup plan at a massive 300 square mile superfund. So this is dealing with CERCLA. And there was basically a really old copper mine, the Anaconda copper mine, that was being cleaned up. Ultimately, there was a nearly unanimous decision, only Alito dissented, in rejecting a broad view federal Superfund scheme. In other words, the state it highlighted deeply rooted presumption in favor of concurrent state court jurisdiction. In other words, the state could be used to supplement the funding that has gone into a super fund, and that the federal government could not control such funding to assist in the cleanup in those efforts. There was an appeal to federalism that ultimately won over in the Atlantic Richfield decision. And so there was an appeal to increase kind of like the state's ability to go beyond just like federal, basic federal efforts. Ultimately, SCOTUS is very sympathetic to the states trying to maintain higher environmental standards overall than the federal government. So if the states go farther than the federal government, in other words, they do seem to recognize the federal government is the floor, and if there is no floor set, that the states have the ability to regulate beyond that. SCOTUS seems to consistently kind of uphold that, and that some federal intervention is in fact justified. And then lastly, it's still a little bit unclear how like Amy Coney Barrett is going to affect upcoming environmental federalism decisions, but ultimately her philosophies on agency deference, the scope of federal agency authority to implement EENR statutes, and the justiciability of environmental claims, I think are going to affect how she starts to decide some of these decisions. She did actually author one of the recent decisions, but it wasn't specific to water necessarily. It was a general environment decision. That is all I have for you. I've gone over a little bit. Thank you for listening to all these facts, and the PowerPoint will also be made available online so you can use that. And there are a ton of notes in the PowerPoint as well for you. Thank you.